Hello, everyone, and welcome back from our lunch break. We now have our next speaker up the stage here. Should be a familiar face for many of you. Jeremiah McCall making his second appearance for Hit Points in History 2024. For anybody who missed his introduction before, Jeremiah has a PhD in Roman history and specializes in historical game studies, history pedagogies, and using video games and board games, and sometimes military and political culture, and systems of the Roman Republic. He has taught high school history, his calling, at Cincinnati County Day School in Ohio for the past 22 years. His book, Gaming the Past, from Routledge, second edition in 2022, is the foundational work for teaching history using video games, as is his website, gamingthepast.net. He's also written a number of investigations on the Roman world, including Cavalry of the Roman Republic, The Sword of Rome, Swords in Cinema, Clan Fabius, Defenders of Rome, and Rivalries that Destroyed the Roman Republic. Currently, he is at work researching and writing Designing Historical Games for Classrooms, a practical guide for educators. TBD on the release year.
Yes,
And
not yet.
despite his busy teaching and writing schedules, he still manages to play more video games than you'd expect him to have time for. And for this second presentation, he'll be telling us about gaming the past, teaching and learning history through video game analysis and critique. Without any further ado, Jeremiah, please take us away.
Thank you so much. So let's see if this is working. Share screen. Window. There we go. How we doing?
We are looking good. We see your full slide there. Are there any notes that you need to see on your end?
Yes, but I think I can find them. There they are. Okay, I got my notes.
Terrific. We don't see your notes, which is what we want. Take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again. As my way too long intro, because I thought you would be reading it, not having it read aloud. Apologize for that. 24 years as a high school history teacher, and Greco-Roman history is my field. But I do a lot of work with games in history class and how you can use video games, but also board games to teach about the past. So I want to kind of give you the kind of quick overview. If you want a longer thing, you can buy the book. That's certainly more expensive than listening to me here, believe it or not. And I want to kind of get you started. If you find yourself having questions and really want to be able to try out games in history class, please just reach out. I'm easy to find. So with that, let us go forward. Really, it's not just about video games. At a certain point, I got involved in video games for reasons. Part of it was because Cincinnati Country Day School had computers and I wanted to take advantage of that. But I've always been a fan of board games as well. And pretty much everything that I'm talking about with you today can work for board games in the classroom too, or analog games. They're different, obviously. There's important differences. Setup, breakdown time, how you teach people how to play, all things like that. But they're similar in terms of both of them represent the past in certain ways, in game ways. And so please, remember that you can apply this widely. And then this book I'm writing really got me to kind of remember again about the value of board games. Because there's a connection of the students. There's an ability to interact and sort of model social situations that is not as easy for a video game to do, I think. So that's very important as well. So not just about video games. All right. So last talk I gave earlier today, I was talking about history as the selective interpretation of the past, right? And if we accept that history is the selective interpretation of the past, and there's not a right history or a single right history, though I do think there are objectively things that are more evidence-based than others, we shouldn't be worrying about, or we shouldn't be focusing on the rote findings of others. We shouldn't be teaching history class the way I certainly was taught as a young person often, and many people are still taught. A presentation of what other people have said. Here's what the textbook says about the past. Here's what this scholar says about the past. Here's what this documentary person says about the past. Learn what they said and be able to reproduce it in some form. And that's not really a good way to learn history, because it suggests that it's basically an authoritarian exercise where you basically take all the work other people have done and then just accept it. So, um, sorry, I was hearing a little beep there and trying to figure out what that was. Okay, phew, still there. So, what I think we should be teaching is how to do history to some extent, how to do source criticism, how to do media criticism, how to look at different things and evaluate, do they seem to be based on evidence or do they seem not to be based on evidence? And I think we should be thinking about agency in systems, how people in the past had choices. Those choices were very much shaped and limited by the systems around them, whether it's systems of food or war or seasons or families or anything like that. But they had some agency and they were able to make choices that had effects. I think that that's a critical way to be approaching history for students. And it's the process over the product. It's the analysis. It's the ability of students to gather some historical evidence, talk about it and think about it, and use it to try and make some sense of how the world was, maybe how the world is. By the way, along the way, I've included little search boxes for you. If you type in those words in your search, you'll find the essay that I wrote here, and I've got a few things like that throughout. I wrote an article once about 14 years ago called "The Unexamined Game is Not Worth Playing." And I was riffing off of Socrates and Plato, right? The idea of the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, of course, playing a game without examining it is fine. I play lots and lots of games that I don't spend much time thinking about carefully. But if you're trying to teach history and look at interpretations of history in video games, it's the critique that you have to do. And it is that act of critique that is the learning experience. The kids are during the learning, not by looking at the game and going, oh, this is how it was. I don't really want them to do that with most sources. But rather, okay, this is how the game is presenting it. What does the other evidence I have around me suggest about this? So that product or process over product, the analysis being the most important part. Okay, as I suggested before, history is something that these days we can define in lots of ways, or rather we can extend it to cover many things. If we take history as my little doodle suggests, that there's me and there's past stuff, and the way it gets communicated is the history part. We can argue about whether somebody's interpretation is valid or not. We can argue about what the sources suggest, but at the end of the day, all of us who do history, whether in our home talking about grandma and her dishes, or whether, at school talking about whatever it is you might be talking about the Peloponnesian War, whatever. Um, those are interpretations of the past. If somebody writes a monograph about the past, again, it's a selective interpretation of the past. So here's a sort of list of ways that one might approach the past. It's not even remotely comprehensive, right? But we've got board games and paintings and websites and books. In Cincinnati, we have a Cincinnati statue from the namesake, and we have a Cincinnati pig statue next to the Cincinnati statue. Both of them are taking elements of the past selectively and critiquing them. And we've got Playmobil games, and we've got Hamilton plays or musicals, and we've got albums. And it's all history. It's all selectively interpreting the past. So that's an understanding I think your students should get. I think they can benefit from that. Now, different media present the past differently, as I said in my earlier talk today. Games, as history, present the past in terms of historical problem spaces. Not meant to be a complicated term, really meant to be a useful tool for teaching about video games. And all it means is that you've got a player agent, and that player agent has some goals in the game. The developers set goals for them, which the player can choose to do or not to do. And that player can make actions and choices, action choices I like to call them, to try and reach that goal. And as they're trying to do that, those actions and choices are contextualized in a game world, right? Every video game about the past is about a game world. Most of the video games we play that are not about the past are also about game worlds, whether it's Mario Kart or Wii Tennis or whatever. But historical games all work this way. So when I say that it's a historical problem space, I'm saying games shape the past this way. Whatever it is they're looking at, triumphs, failures, heartbreaks, whatever they're looking at, games turn their material into a player agent with assigned goals that makes choices to get there in a world that's filled with elements. Games do that in a way more than really any other medium. They create a situation where you're exploring agency in a world of systems. Okay, so could we just give video games to the kids and let them play it, and then they would learn history through historical gameplay? And you know by now that I'm not really a fan of that approach. Yes, there is no question people will learn things when they play video games about the past. People always learn things when they do cognitive exercises, right? If you mean learning in its broad sense. Pick up a new piece of information that may or may not be correct, acquire a skill, acquire an affect or a feeling about something. So yeah, they'll absolutely learn, but will they learn what you were hoping them to experience and hoping them to learn as the teacher? Pretty dicey. Here's just some examples. I mean, leaving aside all the other problems, it is pretty difficult often for game designers to count on what messages their players will get if they just play the game. And that would be an informal player, right? They play the game, they walk away with a message. Again, it's there's plenty of anecdotes about how games that have been crafted with particular messages don't communicate those messages very well to all players. So I got these examples from Soren Johnson, who gave a great talk on this, how hard it is to run a sweatshop. It was a developer talk on just this point. And he notes the Landlord's Game. The Landlord's Game, you may remember, is Elizabeth McGee Phillips, I believe her last name is, her creation in the very early 1900s. And it was called the Landlord's Game. And in the Landlord's Game, basically everybody ended up bankrupt except for the person who owned the most property. And she meant it to be a warning, a teaching game about the evils of excessive capitalism. Well, what happened is Parker Brothers stole it, right? There's a great documentary on this on PBS. You can check it out. Parker Brothers stole it and turned it into Monopoly. And now everybody plays a game that's functionally almost the same, but glorifies capitalism and thinks that it's a good thing that landlords can kick everybody else out. So that's a great example. Down in the bottom left, we have Sweatshop. There was a serious game made called Sweatshop 10, 15 years ago. And it was a game that was intended by the designers to represent the horrors of sweatshops in developing nations in the global South. And you can see from this picture here, right? We've got these workers that are in really bad shape as far as health and stuff like that, that are working on products. But the way they designed the game, and again, this is Soren's observation, the way they designed the game is so you felt empathy for the middle manager. You felt empathy for the person that was hiring these workers and using them. There was all this gameplay talk about how your bosses were putting pressure on you and all these stressors that you had. And the main person doing the talking was the foreperson, was the manager. I can attest to this. Back when I played it, I started playing it, and what happens is you tend to feel sympathetic for the foreman, the foreperson, not for the people that are actually getting, brutalized in the sweatshop. And it was intended to have you be sympathetic towards people who are in these horrible circumstances, the horrible circumstances of labor, not the manager. And then finally, there was an article that was written on DEF CON, which was a nuclear holocaust game 15 years ago, maybe. And what they found, they did some pretty intensive research on players' affect. And what they found is that after a certain point, mechanics sort of took over so much that players weren't even focusing on the game or the game elements. So they were focusing on the buttons and the clicks and the numbers and the things to do to beat your rivals. And while symbolically and sort of representationally, it was global thermonuclear war, it didn't feel like that to the players because they had gotten so engrossed into the mechanics. Now, can games present points about the past? Absolutely. They can present points about the past, and historical game developers can do some great things that way. But at the end of the day, there's no guarantee that somebody's going to pick this up without interpretation. And we can kind of see that as we go along. I had done an article recently about maybe about 6 years ago about historical video games as history, the players and the forums. And as a part of that, I looked at forums and looked at what people were saying about the games they were playing and tried to look for places where they were doing some historical thinking. So I've got 3 examples here. Here's one that's one's arguing about the Spartans in Rome Total War and how the Spartans were way too powerful in the game for what they should have been at this time. And in the middle, they're talking about the religious system in Civilization 4 is broken because it makes every religion a missionary religion rather than a non-missionary religion. And over on the other side, it's from Crusader Kings, and it's talking about female rulers. And in the process of doing this, this person didn't think it was very difficult to have female rulers and kind of went through and talked about different kinds of succession and so on. All of these people are doing history. They're selectively interpreting the past. They're doing the work of history, figuring out what is legitimate and evidence-based and what is not. And the reason I bring this up is because Sean Beavers, who I have her name down there at the bottom, did a dissertation on what players learn from informal play, right? So play without teachers involved. And she found that mostly it was simple facts, simple images, maybe event dates and stuff like that. But that in reality, what she found is that they did the most learning, did the most cognitive sort of development when they were posting after action reports and things like that. So this points to how games should be used, I think, effectively if they're going to be used in a classroom. We've got to give the kids opportunities to do things like these forum posts, to actually argue and interpret and develop their points. Okay, the nice thing about this is using games in the classroom for objects of critical analysis fits the powerful methods of inquiry learning and experiential learning that we know can be really meaningful for deep learning for students. Inquiry learning, you develop questions about the game after playing it. Is this accurate? Why does it shape it this way? Right? You can go in many places. Investigate with valid historical evidence. Craft evidence-based arguments, and then reflect and debrief on the process and results about the game itself overall, about what you experienced playing the game. And so we've got an inquiry learning approach. And it's also an experiential learning approach. Concrete experience of gameplay, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. You're playing with the game, you're getting experiences, you're reflecting on what it means, you're bringing in evidence. So gaming in the past, working with video games or board games in class as historical sources, hits a lot of important pedagogies for us. Okay, time for logistics. How do you do this? Well, the cycle of gameplay analysis is pretty straightforward, though it requires a lot of monitoring from the teacher. As I said here, any gear could be the big one. I put learn to play as the largest one here because I didn't want people to underestimate. Don't underestimate the challenges of getting students to learn games. I'll probably hit this again, but having a student learn a game in class because they're required to is incredibly different than having somebody choose to play a game because they want to and learn the rules. Very, very different. And you've got a budget for that as a teacher in time and preparation, learning to play. Okay. From there, once they've learned to play, transition them into purposeful play, play with analysis and note-taking and things like that. And it's really important to give them some time to learn to play first before you start doing purposeful play, unless it's a really simple game. Okay. If you ask them too many high-level questions and they don't even understand how the game works, that's demoralizing and they're not in a position to answer it. So once you've learned to play, start transitioning into purposeful play. Okay. And then finally, analyze and reflect and evaluate. Think about how the game systems work, talk about it, argue about it. Think about how the historical evidence that you've gathered, reflect on the experience. And this is all really important. We know that debriefing is really critical in simulation study, in studying with simulations. So it is with playing video games too. Again, it's not the gameplay itself alone, it's the reflection on the experience and the evidence. And as I say, it's not all in one class necessarily. It can take place over weeks. It can take place in a single class, and you're going to jump around. You might learn something new from the evidence that causes you to play some more. And then that causes you to find a new thing you didn't know, and you learn to play, and so on and so forth. All right, breaking it down. Learning to play. Assumptions that it is best not to make. It is best, in my 20 years of doing this, not to assume that kids are digital natives. I think that term has kind of disappeared, which is good because it's not very helpful. But this idea that they will pick up games and learn them and it'll be enjoyable and they won't need any motivating or anything like that. It's just not true. You will have some students who are like that, but your students are diverse and they will have many different ideas about games. When it comes to computer games, they probably have all played one, but it might have been Candy Crush on a mobile phone. That's a very different thing from Civilization 4 or 5 or 6. So it's best not to assume that learning it will be easy. Rather, you should have classes and lessons that are structured for learning to play. Sometimes you can do it through direct instruction. I've had a screen of something like Civilization up on my computer, and my kids play along on their screens. Some games you can kind of throw them in. If it's a web-based game, it's usually simple enough that you can do that. You're going to have to plan for that. I'll provide handouts maybe about how the gameplay works, or make them take notes on how the gameplay works. But you gotta plan on how to on getting kids to learn to play, and how you're going to support those that it doesn't come as quickly to. Okay, so after they've learned to play, we get into the purposeful play, which, as I said, a purposeful play is playing with the crucial component of observations and notes. Posing questions. How is the game representing things? Why is it this way? Now, at this point, you might want to start thinking, you probably should have thought about it before with learning to play, but you might want to think about how you're going to organize your kids. You can have kids in a one-to-one situation with computers if you're fortunate enough to have that. And I'm at a school where I am fortunate enough that my kids have their own laptops. But it's not necessary. And sometimes it's even counterproductive to have every student have their own copy of the game running. When every student has their own copy of the game running, they are much more likely to get lost in themselves in what they're doing. And purposeful play, the hallmark of it is stopping them every so often to do notes and observation. So a better way is to have students in pairs or even in trios. So one or two people are focused on taking notes, and then another person is focused on driving the game, as it were. And you could switch through there. But really, really important there to remember that if you have them playing alone, you need to stop them every so often. Actually, it's true even in groups, because the idea is to play some and then consider some questions that the teacher has posed or that they've formed. So a gaming notebook is a good idea. I have noticed over time that if people are playing a game on their computer, then they probably can't take notes on their computer. So it's good to have a physical notebook on the side. One of those composition books or a piece of paper will do. And as part of purposeful play, it's notes, but then it's also discussion sessions, having the students get together and talk about some of their questions and what did they observe. So all of this is to start analyzing the game models. What's it showing and how does it work? And I'm going to give you a little more detail on that in a little bit. All right. So what we're trying to get them to do for their purposeful play is a historical problem space analysis. Okay. As I've explained a historical problem space to you, you can certainly look it up. I've written articles on it, and I'm happy to help you out anytime I can. And this is the first place I think where I have this note in: make sure you level up or down for your students. In my experience, I know that kids at fifth grade level, and I know that students at college level can do analysis on these things. But I also know that you have to shift very much your prompts and your language and your vocabulary, right? It's not just a simple straightforward. I'm presenting it in a way for people that I assume have a college education that you can use for students that are in high school. Level it down if you need to. Okay, so historical problem space analysis. As I said, the crucial component is observation and notes. And you're going to make notes, or it's helpful to have the notes run through the components of the historical problem space. So what do you observe about a player agent? What do you observe about game goals? What do you observe about the choices that you get to make, and so on and so forth? A couple of things I've found really useful. One, provide some specific questions that can be useful, and I'm going to give you some in a couple of minutes. But two, I actually just stumbled upon this last year. I had been dissatisfied with the level of notes often that my students were taking on observing a game. And so what I said is, said this year, and I was really happy with the results, when you are taking detailed observation notes, you need to be describing the features of the game space in ways that would be descriptive and clear to somebody who hasn't played it. That's what we're really looking for. Observation notes that pull so much of the visual and play detail out that somebody who hadn't played the game could understand them. That's really helped me clarify what I want for notes from my students. Descriptions for non-players. The other thing in all of this that I sort of mentioned at the start, but I'll bring back up again, is we're teaching through this media critique. And we're teaching this central idea that to critique, whether it's a text or a speech or whatever it is, we have to observe it, if we include our hearing as part of the observing, and be able to describe in detail its different parts. That's how you make a critical, educated analysis of something, right? You observe and explain it and pull out the details, and then you analyze what those details mean. This historical problem space approach is designed to do just that. Okay, now, big picture, by turning the historical record into a game, you want to ask yourself, what's achieved and what's lost? What do you get in a game version of history that you wouldn't get in a text version? One of the things, for example, that is clear to me over the years is that games generate empathy, or rather they have the potential to generate empathy. But it's not always empathy with a character that we really want them to empathize with. For example, there's a game called 7 Cities of Gold that had a remake in the 90s. And Internet Archive has a version of it that you can freely play. And so I'll have my students play it, and then they do some reading and take some lecture notes on Spanish colonization of the Americas. Well, the game puts you in the role of a conquistador, and everything is from that perspective. And so if you're going to feel any empathy about decision making, it's going to be with that character. Well, you better discuss that with your students rather than just presenting that unproblematically to them, like, hey, this is what it felt like to be a conquistador. So what you really want to do is think about what's achieved by this and what's lost. Part of what's being lost is other people's points of views. What's emphasized and what's ignored in a game. What's simplified and what's enriched in a game. Those are kind of the big questions. But you don't get to those immediately. Definitely not immediately, and it takes a long time sometimes to get people to be trained to do this. So here's some questions that I've put together. I believe this is being recorded, so when it gets posted at some point, you can come back and get these. But I also have an article that's coming out in a few months that will list a lot of these questions. Basically, these are going to be some different questions about historical problem space components. And the way I think they should be used is they should be used to give to students for discussion during their purposeful play, to be used for note-taking, and to sort of get them to look at the different parts before they get into what does it mean to have this history represented as a game. So, player agent questions. With player agent questions, you want to ask questions about, do they occupy space in the game world? Or are they like an outside mouse click that you never see their body represented? Are they reflective of the historical evidence? Is this about a specific person that can be documented? Or is this about an archetype, a kind of person, an occupation or class that you're looking at? Do the things that they can do in the game match what they could do in historical evidence? What does it mean to be able to make choices as this player? How does all of this change or shape the way you appreciate colonization of the Americas, or running a farm, or building a civilization, or anything like that? So those are sort of questions you can do for player agent questions. For design goals are really important because the goals do so much to shape how the game developers look at the past. So what are the main goals? What's the stuff that's primary that you have to do? But then what are the goals that make that up? So like in a real-time strategy game, you might have to earn lots of gold so you could build units so you could destroy your enemy. Again, notice these problematic goals that are coming up and discussing why they're problematic and how they not only deviate from the historical record, but kind of represent some pretty immoral things over time. That's an important part of the discussion. Are the goals triumphant? When you win the game, do you feel like a victor, or do you feel like you've just managed to scrape by? There's a terrific game called When Rivers Were Trails that was made by indigenous Anishinaabe people in Minnesota, I believe, developers. And they made this game where you are forced from your land by U.S. settler policies and have to leave from Minnesota and travel all the way to California to get a new home. And it's meant to be a play on Oregon Trail, the classic game, and saying, okay, yeah, all that settlement resulted in the displacement and impoverishment and all these other horrible things for indigenous people. When you win that game, when you get to the successful ending, the not dying ending, you have made it to your goal. But the goal is you made it to a Native American reservation in California, a land that you're not from, with geography that may not be anything that has to do with your life. And that's how you end the game. That's not triumphant. Age of Empires, the video game, they say you are victorious. When Rivers Were Trails, it has a victory that I'd call more attenuated. So these are the sorts of things we can look at with games and compare them with goals. Oh, I like this one. Sorry, I was just seeing this at the bottom. What other goals might have been designed for this player agent? Could you give a player agent different goals and still keep the same game? Or would you have to change stuff? So again, using that 7 Cities of Gold example, if you were going to have a game from the perspective of the native people in the villages, you'd have to radically change the game because their agency is so reduced in the game and the focus is so on the European colonizer. So again, these are good questions to ask for analysis. Non-player agent questions are my favorites. It is a really insightful thing, or it gives a lot of insight rather, to figure out who is explicitly represented in a historical video game and who's not. Is the game focused on the labors of everyday people, or is it focused on the powerful and famous? Non-player agents, do they have agency? I call them non-player agents instead of non-player characters, because I believe that everybody has agency or should have agency. And non-player agent reminds you that historically these people, however they're represented in the game, had agency. So what I want my kids to talk about is how much. Are marginalized people treated problematically, like they are simply there to serve or to be fought or anything like that? What is the game focusing on? And is it problematic or not? Could you turn the game and make it about one of the non-player agents? What would have to change in the game? Some of this stuff really gets into the biases of Western developers, biases that a lot of us struggle with as Western educators, and so can be really good questions about non-player agents. Action choices. Games are about agency. They're about making choices, and in historical games, it's about making choices in systems. So at the end of the day, how is your character able to act is critical. That's what a game does. What are the choices? What does the game suggest are the primary choices and actions of a person in a problem space? Are the choices open-ended? Can they do different strategies? Can they experience the results? What kind of behaviors is a big one? Like, what kind of behaviors are encouraged? Is it like accounting, like in a management simulation? Is it conquest? Is it exploration or domination? Is it managing logistics like a supply chain? What kind of behaviors does the game want you to to be involved in? And are these problematic behaviors in history or in the present? Is another really important question to ask. All right, so that analysis gets you back to the big question. Okay, we have learned to play. We've done our purposeful play with notes and observation. That notes and observation has been driven both by trying to describe things as somebody, so that somebody who had not played the game could understand them. Those those notes can also be based on all those many questions I gave you, and those are just some. You can come up with your own, have the kids come up with their own. So they've taken a fair amount of notes. They've discussed with each other a fair amount of the notes. Getting the kids working together is a really good thing. And at the end, there needs to be some kind of reflection. And for me, that becomes an evaluation as well. And by evaluation, I mean the students are evaluating the game and how it takes the historical record and shapes it into something that is not quite what the historical record may have said. Again, though, all history takes the historical record and shapes it into something that is not exactly the same as what happened in the past. Read about any kind of physical encounter, from war to giving birth to children, in text, and I guarantee that the text is not the same as what actually happened. So games are no different that way. They'll achieve things and they'll lose things. They'll emphasize things and ignore things. They'll figure out they'll simplify things and they'll enrich things. So at the end, I would have them writing an essay using historical evidence that they've found from lecture notes or research and comparing it to the game. Or I would have them do an observation analysis where they explain the features of the game and spent more time talking about the game space than necessarily the evidence. I happen to give a fair amount of essays because writing well is really important in the school I'm in. You could do videos, you could do podcasts, you could do drawings. But at the end of the day, coming to some big picture conclusions about games and history and what this particular combination was that you've had them learn. So that's the end of my presentation. Again, can't encourage you enough. Please reach out to me at any point. Always happy to talk shop, and always happy to help you work on gaming the past in any form that you want. Thank you.
Well, let me give you another round of applause here, Jeremiah. Thank you again for an excellent presentation. I'm not sure if you can see the audience here. We have some folks throwing some confetti. We also have some folks who are, looks like, ready to ask some questions for your Q&A. And I am seeing a raised hand here from Linda, so I want to welcome you up to the Q&A here towards the mic, so you can go ahead and ask your question to Jeremiah and the rest of the room.
I see one in chat that I can start with.
Yeah, go ahead with Luke's question.
Okay. So what games would I recommend for this type of teaching? And thank you. I'm glad you found it useful. I only wish I could reach more people because after doing this for 20 years, I'm not famous and I don't need to be, but it'd be nice to help more people with this approach. Games I recommend for doing this type of teaching, it depends on the class, obviously. I find in general that games that offer more sort of focused historical experiences tend to be better than larger ones. But that's just me. So, for example, I have struggled over the years with Civilization because it's covering such broad trends that it's hard sometimes to really link whatever the day's lesson is to a game like that. I prefer things like city builders. For example, with my students in 9th grade ancient world history, they're playing a Sumerian city builder called Nebuchadnezzar. And it's more focused. It's not something we're going to play for the whole year. And I think that's really good. So I think games that are more focused are that way. Board games, honestly, I think you go to Board Game Geek and you make sure that whatever game you pick is not harder than a 2.5. I have found that simpler games are better as far as getting people to learn to play. So I think, you know, that's kind of a broad answer to your question. But for me, the simpler the game, the better. They're already going to be complex anyways because they're board games and video games. So I would look at things that are focusing on a 2 or 3 week unit or something like that because you're going to have to build in playtime and learning to play.
Well, thank you very much for that thoughtful answer there. I'm not seeing Linda's hand raised anymore, but we do have Julie here who's ready to ask a question.
Hi, Julie.
And I am sorry, Julie, you are on mute. There we go.
Sorry, I just noticed that.
Quite all right.
Good to see you, Jeremiah, and
Nice
wonderful talk as always.
Oh, thank you.
I have 2 questions. One's kind of silly and one's a more technical question. The first one is, what have you been playing in class lately?
So lately, I've switched. I'm teaching a modern world history class, and I've been doing something with Paradox about Europa Universalis. It's going to get announced at the end of the month. And so as part of that, I had Europa Universalis for my kids, and we were going to work on it in class. And I found that it was just too taxing for their laptops. Like, it worked on mine, but it didn't quite work on theirs. So in a pinch, I went to Civilization 5. But I honestly think at this point that, so here's the thing. There are teachers who are going to do great stuff with Civilization. If you're talking about broad trend teaching, you can't beat it. I don't do broad trend teaching as much as I going into the particular situations. So I think I'm going to put that away for a while. Right now for my 10th graders, the big thing we've been doing with games is they've been designing their own. So they had to research and design historical games. And then this semester, they're researching and designing a text-based game. The only video game I've used with my 10th graders so far is that Seven Cities of Gold. When I go back to 9th graders, I like Pocket Civs. That's apparently a board game port that just came out, and it looks like it's going to give me some of that Civilization action, but in a much more restrictive bundle. I like Nebuchadnezzar. So those are games I'm using. And then the other thing I've been doing is designing some games for my students in class, and really appreciating those. So I'm in between video games at the moment, but that's the stuff I've been using.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to ask is I know that you do a lot of board game work in the classroom, and I was wondering if you could get more into the differences that you see in using board games versus video games.
Sure. So one of the big issues is logistics, right? When you use a board game, you've got physical stuff set up. And that means you have to start thinking about your bell schedule and the length and whether you can leave things in the room or get them or stuff like that. So I tend to default towards games that are playable in a 50-minute period. And I'll teach them one day and have them play them the next. So for my 9th graders, this last year, and I'll use again, I liked Roll Through the Ages, the Bronze Age, which is a dice roll and write. And Seven Wonders Architects, which is a very simplified version of Seven Wonders. And both of those I could teach in 15 minutes, have them play for 35 to learn it, and then have them play one more time, and then we do the analysis. So one of the big things is logistics. I think you need to pick a game that's simple enough. That's simple enough. And when you're presenting when you're presenting a board game, you're the tutorial. So you want to be careful how you teach it too. If you can, if at all possible, guide them through a round of play. Say, you're player one. Okay, here's what the sheet says. You do this, and you do this, and you do this. And that can be really helpful for jump-starting that. What board games tend to deliver are two things that I think video games often don't as much. The number one thing is social interaction. You are in a group with other people. And so I think games that are competitive or collaborative, but that benefit from people working together, that's a shoe-in for board games. And then the other thing is, potentially, empathy is a tricky subject, but potentially you can get some more empathy for an agent if you do that. So that's the sort of stuff I would be thinking of with board games. And video games, it's very similar stuff, but there you have to worry about your hardware requirements. And there you don't necessarily have, even if it's multiplayer, you've got a very different kind of environment if you're text or voice chatting or something like that. So my thoughts.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Oh, thanks, Megan.
I just want to welcome anyone else who has other questions or comments to please approach that Q&A line or share them in the chat. We do still have a little bit of time here before our next presenter. And just as a reminder for everyone, the numerous search suggestions that Jeremiah had throughout his presentation, I have pulled the links for, and those are listed above in the chat as well.
Very good. And it's very easy to find me. Hoping we'll talk shop some more. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, one last thank you to Jeremiah for his presentation and his earlier presentation today, doing a double header. And just as a quick programming note to let everyone know what to expect next. We are going to have another presentation coming up here in just about 12 minutes at 3 p.m. Central Time. And that's going to be with Megan Sullivan with a presentation titled How the Underworld Helps the Gaming World. How the eschatological beliefs of ancient Greeks can help game developers with world building. Excellent rhyme, even if my pronunciation isn't quite up to that level. So we look forward to hearing Megan present in just about 12 minutes here at 3 p.m. Central.